Welcome to our monthly ACTS Town Hall. Thanks to our member companies for helping make these town halls possible. Your support makes our mission a reality. Together in safety, stronger in collaboration. The ACTS Town Halls are an open forum to discuss concerns and present potential solutions to improve damage prevention and excavation safety. These town halls are meant to be a discussion, and you're encouraged to ask questions and share solutions. A recording of this town hall will be posted on our YouTube channel and sent via email after the town hall has concluded. Before the end of the town hall, each of our panelists will highlight a moving forward step to ensure we stay focused on practical and impactful solutions. We are pleased to have a knowledgeable and experienced panel with us today. So to get us started, our moderator will begin with brief introductions.
Hello, everybody. We appreciate you joining us today. Another ACTS Town Hall, talking about something that I've heard more about in the last 6 weeks than I have in the last 6 years, and that's the term excavator readiness. We do have a distinguished panel for sure. That's distinguished, not extinguished. And we're going to ask them to introduce themselves first, and then we're going to get right into the discussion. First, Scott, tell us who you are.
Yeah, hi. Good to be here. I'm Scott Crawford. I serve as president and CEO with Virginia 811. Again, happy to be here and have this conversation.
Ms. Megan?
Well, good morning. I'm Megan Rafinski, president and CEO at Georgia 811.
Thank you. James?
James Wingate, USA North 811. I'm the executive director.
Kenny?
Kenny Spade, Manager of Data Analytics and QA/QC with Virginia 811. Happy to be here today.
Thank you. Greg?
Yeah, Greg Abernathy, Georgia 811, and I'm the Director of Enterprise Services.
And finally, Benjamin.
Hi, my name is Benjamin Durker. I'm the Executive Director of the Alliance for Innovation and Infrastructure, or AII. And AII is the only nationwide public policy think tank dedicated to infrastructure.
Thank y'all. Appreciate it. So let's just get right into this because we only have an hour and we've got several hours worth of thoughts that need to be processed. I'm going to start with Megan. And the reason I'm going to do that, Megan, is I told you not too long ago, I think you were the first person I ever heard refer to excavator readiness. I'm kind of curious as to how that came about and what led you to focus on that so much for the state of Georgia?
A couple of years ago, we implemented a new data tool that really gave us an incredible view into a lot of information, including PRIS responses. And at that time, I was hearing the phrase on-time completion used a lot between different stakeholder groups. And I got a hunch that meant something different to different groups. And through working with the board and my staff, and I have an excavator advisory committee, it confirmed my hunch. Most of the members and locators were using on-time completion to describe the act of making sure a PRIS response was in by the legal date and time. Excavators were using it to mean we can start work. And when you're having that fundamental disagreement between a phrase, it became obvious to me we needed a different set of words to describe these two situations. Because in Georgia, your PRIS response is mandatory, and you could be up for a violation if you don't respond. So that is an important metric. You have to put it in there. Georgia has a lot of PRIS codes, and on average, 7 members respond to each ticket. But not every code means work can begin. And if one member uses one of those codes that means work can't begin for a variety of reasons, then excavation readiness is not achieved. So it became important to introduce this phrase to start a different conversation now that we had different metrics to look at, and start cutting out some of the confusion and the frustration around people using the same phrase to describe different things.
Makes perfectly good sense to me. I'm sure that Scott, like me and other folks across the country, when they first heard that term, they thought about it, but not all of us decided to write an article about what it meant to them. Scott, What caused you to do that, do you think?
Yeah, well, it really, a whole host of variables came together to lead to the creation of what I had written and worked with AII to publish. First and foremost, I think Virginia, like other states throughout the nation, if not all states throughout the nation, have been seeing with the pandemic first, 2020, and then the infrastructure bill that was contributing so much to rural broadband expansion, that the 811 process, at least again in Virginia, and I feel most of the nation, was under a lot of pressure. And we were seeing no-shows rising to some degree, and there were some challenges there. In Virginia, we started around 2022 at least, of having consistent stakeholder meetings and town halls to bring stakeholders together to talk about some of the challenges that were being faced. We even introduced some law changes to the Virginia law, which was the first time in a couple of decades at least. And so when we heard about the excavation readiness piece, that was intriguing to approach it that way. We really appreciated what Georgia was doing, and the model that they developed. Similar to Georgia, we too have a rather lengthy list of positive responses. Same as Georgia. If one member does not adequately fulfill their responsibilities to locate the utilities, provides a code that maybe prevents the ability for the utility to be marked or demonstrated where it is or approximate location, the excavator cannot begin work, and that was creating those delays. And so within all of that going on, we had worked with Virginia Tech to do an analysis, and we started getting some preliminary information to give us an idea that definitively excavation readiness, based on no-shows alone at first, it was decreasing some percentage points. And so when we heard again what Georgia was doing and their approach, we looked at their model and used it as somewhat of an inspiration. As Kenny then worked with it to make it fit for Virginia. And so out of all of this, we came up with the recognition that excavation readiness was really hovering around the, on average in the past 5 years, 82% mark. So then when we heard a national dialogue somewhat unfolding that excavation readiness was 50%, we were like, well, that's a little different. And so I wanted to share what we were doing in Virginia, the data we had, and ultimately with the paper, to use it as a wedge to break open a wider discussion about data in general, and to kind of remind everybody that we need to be careful with data, that data is simply information that is interpreted. Data is not fact. It is something that is up for interpretation. And so the language we use around data, it can drive decisions, as we all know, and we just need to be careful and step back and make sure that the decisions we're making are truly aligned with a well-vetted database, and have had the dialogue and asked the questions that are needed to advance for progress. So that's kind of what went into the thinking behind the paper, and I was very appreciative to AII for publishing it and letting it get out into people's eyes, let them see it.
Thank you. So I'm a nerd when it comes to reading. I read lots of things because there's lots of information, lots of viewpoints in the world. Familiar with AII. And so, Benjamin, I mean, what was it about this particular thing? Of all the things you could publish and write about, what intrigued you about this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of credit goes to Scott and Kenny for putting something interesting forward. But ultimately, Scott reached out to us. We are, like I said, we're the only infrastructure think tank. So we're an outside stakeholder group here, or I should say we're not a stakeholder. We're a third party. We study public policy and industry action, and really seek to educate and raise awareness about critical issues. Because we're an infrastructure-wide organization, we're looking at whole systems and how things are interacting, and what are the public policy frameworks that can either solve problems or, in some cases, create problems. And what's interesting with the data Scott put forward and what's happening in Virginia is it intersects with a lot of the things happening at the federal government and nationwide trends. Fiber optic infrastructure is being deployed. It's going to rural areas, and the loads for locators are looking different than they were 10 years ago. And so coming from that infrastructure wide vantage point, it was a really fascinating topic to say, how are all of these things influencing each other? And really, it was Scott reaching out. We had a number of very candid conversations about what's the goal with the paper. What are you trying to do with it? I certainly shared that AII, our goal is to be more. It's to add more dialogue to the conversation, more collaboration. There's an incredible amount of resources from CGA. PHMSA constantly puts out incredible damage prevention information, educational resources. But we want to be one of those voices as well, just helping put more information out there. Anyone who wants to read our reports, we would love that. But I want you to read CGA reports too. I want you to read anything happening in other organizations. And so we just wanted to host a good dialogue, have, like Scott mentioned, kind of crack open that national debate. And sometimes it takes a third party to kind of say, all right, we'll host that. And so now we've had this incredible opportunity, Roger, to bring it right back into the industry and let the people who actually know it dialogue about it. So we were sort of a platform, and we're not trying to drive that conversation. I think Scott's driving that conversation, Megan's driving that conversation, and others. And I'm happy to be along for the ride and help add a little bit of insight if I can.
Well, I think you've accomplished that. I think both of you accomplished that. And as is usually the case, folks are taking sides instead of discussing where this needs to go. James, I mean, you're kind of a known commodity and recognized as a mover and a shaker in the industry. So how does this, from your perspective, how does this then get into the national discussion where it's not just a sidebar, but rather it's it becomes the focal point of what we're trying to do as an 811 center and as the other stakeholder groups. We need to have things ready for the excavator to go to work. How do we do that?
Well, I think, as Benjamin mentioned, we want this to be talked about in as many venues as possible, not exclusively at one conference or another, or one small local meeting or another, but all of the above. And so Megan and I have the honor and responsibility to serve as co-chairs of the OCSI committee, which is One Call Systems International, which represents, all the 811 centers as well as our counterparts in other countries. And this topic has been without using that term excavation readiness, because like you said, Megan coined it, but we've been talking about it for a while, as well as the CGA data committee. I remember one discussion in particular where, because we've been tracking this in California and Nevada, which are the two states that my center serves, Northern California and Nevada, for those of you who may not be familiar with USA North 811. And we were finding the exact same thing that Megan mentioned. And I just was looking at our most recent stats prior to this, so I had those on the tip of my tongue. But we're finding that in terms of, do utility operators provide a response to the electronic positive response system? Yes, they do. We're finding they're in the mid 90% of tickets are being responded to. But we realized that, or we were still hearing complaints from excavators that they weren't seeing that. So we decided to start measuring it another way in terms of if we deliver 5 million outbound tickets and 4 million responses come back, well, that's 4 out of 5 or 80%, easy math that way. And that's where we get the 95% that I was talking about. But if you measure it on the same ticket, how often were we getting responses from every single member on the same ticket? And the first time we started measuring that a few years ago, we were showing about 70% responses total and only 40% on the same ticket. So that was eye-opening to me, and I think to our board of directors, but it was not eye-opening to some of the large contractors who said, well, I could have told you that. We've been tracking that internally. So that was kind of validating for them to see that it wasn't exclusive to just them. So anyway, so we started tracking that, but now we're getting to the point where the regulators are paying attention. At least this is what I'm hearing across the country. The regulators are paying attention to and looking at people who are not submitting any response. So but now we're starting to get flows that don't make sense. For example, if you expect a ticket to, let's say it's 4 blocks long in an urban area, well, maybe that's not realistic for locators to complete that in 3 business days. And so they say, hey, excavator, we can't do it this much, but which end are you starting on? And we'll do the first block and then we'll keep up, we'll stay ahead of you. And they say, yeah, we're starting on the north side and working this way. And so that would, in the response codes, we would expect that to be negotiated working schedule and then later on marked. But instead, we're starting to see all kinds of sequences of codes that don't flow the way we envision them to, like clear, and then, oh, wait, not clear. We have something, but we need to have a meet. Now, that could be an honest mistake. A utility operator didn't realize they had something there. Maybe the map didn't show something, but then later on the locator was out there and realized, oh, we do have something there. But when you see it in huge quantities, that's when it gets suspicious. Like when you're in the thousands of times that's happening. So our regulators in both California and Nevada are really paying attention to it. And so I'm not trying to point fingers at any operators. Some of it for sure is, at least in California, this is relatively new, where electronic positive response didn't become mandatory in the law until 2021. And of course, you know what that means is that the big operators are familiar with it and they're on the ball right when it starts. But we still have some small cities and some small water districts who claim to not be aware that this is even a thing yet. And so the word is still getting out. And so I guess for other states, where I know some states have had positive or electronic positive response in their law for decades. So it is interesting to see the different ways across the country where this is being tracked, and realizing that it's not just as easy as tickets sent, responses received. It's much more nuanced as we get into it.
It's interesting, and I certainly would agree with that. So, Greg and Kenny, you see what a wasp nest you created here? So my question for you is, I mean, I know these other folks had some great ideas, but y'all had the expertise to come up with whatever the algorithms or the formulas that you needed to measure for your particular states. You weren't thinking about the other states, you were thinking about your state, and I get it. So Greg, let's start with you. I mean, so when you were doing this, what did you think you needed to do to give Megan what she was looking for?
Right. Well, when Megan came to me with a question, it was like, can we measure how many excavations are going to be ready to dig on time? Can we measure it? And so I'm like, well, let me find out. Right. So I first started, I wanted to make sure that whatever query I came up with for our data would match what that meant. So I had to start by defining some of the terms, right? So we're calculating a rate, we're dividing one number by another number. What are those, right? So starting out with tickets, that sounds like a good starting point, but not every ticket allows for excavation, right? So we want to first identify just those that are excavation tickets, right? Then we want to take a look at some of the behaviors that happens on tickets, like when is a ticket canceled? If it's canceled before it's legal to dig, then we want to exclude those tickets, right? If it's canceled after, we're measuring excavation readiness. Can the excavator dig? Even if they later cancel it, it doesn't matter, right? Then we also have a method of bidirectional positive response in Georgia where excavators can actually dispute, right? So if a member says they're clear, then the excavator looks and they see a pedestal or they see some other evidence of a facility there, then they call us back and say, someone's not clear, right? I see some telecom, I see some water, something here on site, so something's wrong. So we also wanted to take into account those disputes, right? So as I was going through this, we've done a lot of reporting in Georgia. So just sort of pulling on some of that expertise that I gained from coming up with other metrics and such. I wanted to make sure all those factors were taken into account. So I actually created sort of an abstract mathematical formula, right? So that I could take into account all those things. And then I started querying, right? Trying to match that up, right? Because I wanted this to be good, because I knew, especially when I started first seeing the results of these queries, I knew this was going to have scrutiny, right? Because when we're looking at when we're looking at on-time completion, which is what our previous metric was, you look at that and it looks great. I mean, it looks, high 90s, 95 over 97%, looks great. But then, not all of our response codes, we have a lot of response codes, as Megan said, but not all of them mean that the excavator is ready to go, right? So we have a lot of response codes. For instance, they couldn't complete the markings due to weather. That's a valid code, but it does mean that the excavation was not ready to start on time, right? So we wanted this metric. We had to have it right. So I first created that formula and then started working the query on that to make sure, right? So that was really our process. I believe that on the ground behavior leaves traces in the data. And my job, when I'm developing these queries and developing these metrics, is to try and find those traces of behavior in the data and bring them to light, right? And so that's exactly what I was doing here. That's how we developed that model and implemented it.
That's interesting. You're one of those guys. When I was going to school, that was 100 years ago, Greg. But when I was going to school, I always was envious of those guys, like your the way your brain is thinking. So Kenny, I'm thinking, so okay, so Georgia's done their thing. Perhaps you had heard about what they've done. I'm sure you had, but you were inspired to, rather than copy not that what Greg did is right or wrong, is what Greg did, but you were inspired to, on your own, come up with a different concept. I mean, what inspired you to do that?
I have a very similar story as the one Greg just told, I'd say. I remember when his work came out on this, he put it out, I want to say through the FNCA. And, reading through that at the time, it certainly piqued my interest. We didn't really dig into it at that point. I'd say Scott and I kind of got together on this a little bit later on as some of those conversations began to emerge in the industry. Some of that rhetoric around the coin toss, 50-50 chance, that kind of thing. Just gut feeling, being close to our data for a very, very long time and being really familiar with our processes, it just didn't feel like that would be the case. And it turned out that it wasn't, of course, in Virginia. But as far as the approach to the problem, certainly, I think Greg kind of paved the way for all of us here with that. Every state's going to have to look at this differently. It's good to hear that folks on this call are acknowledging that. I think at times there can be a notion that we need to be comparing things state to state in some way that is going to be apples to apples. And that just really isn't the reality in many cases. We all have, I would say, very unique operating environments, and certainly Virginia has some uniqueness. Our model is really similar, I'd say, in concept to what Greg has done. And conceptually, I've told some folks, I think it's kind of simple. We first identify the tickets that are eligible to be evaluated. As Greg said, that's not every ticket. It's a subset. It's going to be the ticket we can sort of expect to go through the normal marking process. And from there, it's a matter of iterating through that list and identifying what I'm calling disqualifying events. Once again, similar to Georgia, we had to sit down and talk about what that looked like. We had to define each of those disqualifying events. And part of it is the timeliness of the responses. As a side note, I think many people watching this are probably aware Virginia recently moved to a new ticket platform, the Earth Exactix platform. I'm very happy to report the data structure in that system is wonderful, clearly designed for analytics, just a major improvement from where we were before. And with that, I'm able to do a lot more with the data. One really interesting piece of that is that I can look at a snapshot of the responses that were posted at the moment the ticket was cleared. I can do that very easily. That has been huge for this particular analysis, because that's definitely part of what we want to know, right? Like at that moment in time, what was the situation? And we had to go through a very long list of positive response codes in Virginia and determine which ones should be indicators that the locator would not or could not check that site for utilities. And that's the first layer of disqualifiers, if you will. From there are additional layers. I'm not going to get too detailed here, but similar to Georgia, we're looking at premature cancels. If a ticket's canceled before it's due, that sort of removes the obligation on the locator's part. We also look at 3-hour notices. In Virginia, this is a notice that essentially tells us there's an issue at the site. Once again, a little plug for our new Exactix platform. This system uses a lot of JSON data fields, structured data fields that I can extract precise values from. So I can actually look to see precisely the reason for the 3-hour notice. And that's been really helpful here. So I can look to see if a 3-hour notice was done to alert us of clear evidence of unmarked utilities. If that's the case, at any point in the lifespan of the ticket, and that's a critical piece, then that ticket is disqualified. One really unique piece of that for Virginia that may prove to be a point of contention for some is the extension agreements. In Virginia, we have a code 60 response that can be posted when a locator has discussed a sort of extension to the schedule with the excavator and it's been agreed upon. That code is only logged when that agreement is made. So we do not initially look at that as a disqualifier. But if that agreement is not met or honored, then the onus is on the excavator to submit a 3-hour notice for that reason. And that's when we can tell, okay, that was not met, therefore that ticket is going to be disqualified from readiness. And then finally, of course, pretty obvious, we look at a lack of responses. Any instance of a locator or an operator failing to respond by the due date would result in that ticket not being considered ready. And then in the end, we just take the pool of ready tickets, do the basic math there using the denominator of the original eligible pool, and that's our percentage. So in a nutshell, that's kind of how we approached it. Very similar to I would say, to what Georgia has done.
Yeah, you came out with significantly different scores. I'm going to call them scores, numbers, whatever you want to call them. And I know that does not mean that either one of you think that yours are better or worse. There's scores for your state, the way you measured things and the codes that you currently use. So how can we talk about these things in a very transparent way to keep the discussion going, to really improve two things? One, to improve what you guys have already started to work on. And the second thing is to improve overall that discussion and the need for transparency and damage prevention. Frankly, I think that's been a missing element for some reason, even though there's a lot of talk about it. James, can you help pull me out of this? You know what I'm saying? How do we go from where we are to there?
You know, I think this potentially could be fascinating and lead to where I personally think it's going to go is it's going to highlight the effectiveness of enforcement and the importance of correct enforcement. So I mentioned California and Nevada, how we're just tracking the codes. Well, we haven't separated them out to say, because right now in California, we have 20 codes. One of them is clear, one of them is marked, and 18 reasons why it wasn't marked. Sometimes sometimes it's the excavator needs to do something like provide access or pre-mark in white paint. Our law requires that. And sometimes it's the operator needs to do something, such as they don't have tracer wire on it, and so they're going to have to do something different, things like that. But we currently don't have a clear message to the excavator about which code allows you to proceed and which one says you can't proceed yet. And so that's making it so when I mentioned before where, okay, well, now we're tracking it on the same ticket, 40%. That's now up into the mid 70s, which is way better than it was. Still not great. But the excavators would say, well, that's nice that we now have a response on 70% of the tickets, but they're still not all responses that give me the green light to dig.
Mhm.
So we're just now going through and putting those into buckets. And we introduced a dispute feature in Nevada, similar to what we said before, because the excavators had complaints about, I didn't agree to a negotiated marking schedule. Nobody contacted me. And so Nevada asked for that. We just went live with it on August 1st. So the first month, I was very curious to see how often it would be used because the regulator committed that he would investigate every single one. And we had 27 times it was used in Nevada. So not a lot. And that's good as far as hopefully they're being selective about when it's used and that they can really back up that claim that the excavator can say it's being disputed. But I guess where I'm going with this is that I really think that the states that have good enforcement, and that was actually one of my biggest takeaways from Scott's article, is how impressed I am with Virginia and their enforcement. Now, they've been doing this for decades. It's not like this happens overnight. And sometimes it starts with a huge high profile damage, unfortunately, in most states. But what I'm finding is that a handful of states that have really good enforcement, like Virginia, like New Mexico, like Nevada, are having fewer damages in general. And I think these codes are really starting to, and this discussion we're having today about the truthfulness of what's really happening in the field, because I think that's what this is ultimately saying, is that now we're really seeing data of truly how often things are being marked on time. And so that's going to force a core evaluation of the entire system, such as, let's say we get to a point where we're accurately reporting how often every single ticket is ready to go. And we find that whatever that percentage is unacceptable to the regulators, to the excavating community. And then we say, but we have on the other hand, some critics will say, well, it's going to be impossible for locators to keep up because we have this system where the excavator can ask for whatever they want. There's no cap. They can do huge tickets. They can do large volumes of tickets. And so in other conversations, we have things going on about how to handle large projects like a fiber build and things like that. And that's happening in other conversations. And kudos again to Georgia for being on the forefront of that extra tricky discussion. But I think it's going to force, now that we're finally going to have data, once this happens in every state, we're really going to have to question, is the current system acceptable where the excavator can ask for whatever they want? Or are we going to have to throttle it in some way or force the planning up front and get the planning and design process to be more robust, where again, only a handful of states have that? And I don't know that anybody has it figured out fully, to be honest. I mean, Pennsylvania has a very mature program, but I don't even think they would claim that it is perfect. And so there are a lot of states where I guess I see these all related together, but this is a key component because now it's going to have the data to prove that we have to look at the whole system and either say, this is what it is. Is it acceptable? Stop complaining. If it's acceptable, the excavator, stop complaining that things aren't always ready when you want. Or do we say, all right, we got to look at this in a different way. And we're going to have some tiers where maybe we guarantee homeowner tickets, you're going to respond to those on time. But excavator, after you've submitted more than X number, now yours have to start getting pushed back farther, or they're in a queue because it's part of a project or something like that. I mean, I'm excited for this because this hasn't happened in 50 years. There's been hints of it here and there, but I really think now that data is becoming more available and being tracked more granularly through these exact things with positive responses, that we're going to see the data that's going to force decision making. So I'm excited for this.
Cool. Yeah, I am too on a lot of fronts. I'm interested in the discussions that's going to follow. Benjamin, with your expertise and such, transparency that we're talking about now, which, as I'm listening to these folks talk, I can see a level of transparency necessary to make significant changes in the industry, and that's what we've got to do. I guess my question is this. So So we're going to be working with the data sets that we have in our states. What's the danger of using scientifically invalid data to make a determination within our state that kind of makes us feel like we're behind everybody else in the world? I mean, how do we have to approach this data? What questions do we need to have?
I think the data question and transparency, those two really have to go hand in hand, is probably the most fundamental question here, because Scott has mentioned data still has to be interpreted, but I think a lot of people don't realize they have data when they do. Everything can be data, like all these different positive response codes, and Raymond in the chat has added that can increase complexity if there's all these different codes, and sometimes the simplest route is the best way to get compliance. But with all those codes, like James mentioning and Kenny's mentioned, you can then discern how behaviors are happening. People use this code, and then gives you more data to analyze how decisions are being made, and kind of what's really happening. So it is a give and take, that more data can complicate the picture and also give you more things to analyze. And I think a lot of people have data. They don't realize that they could just be putting out reports and analysis, and then, like Scott, invite people to critique it. We don't necessarily know that this law change or this approach to something is effective until we've put some data out there, and it could be totally wrong. You could have the wrong narrative about it, and somebody else can say, hey, I saw how you put that together, what you thought the analysis was, but I don't think you're right. And then you can tighten it and improve it. And if every state is doing that with what's happening in their state over time, that'll, iron sharpens iron. If you're trying to do it in your state, and it is a different context, it looks a little different, but somebody can still critique that. I think that's where we have to go from here. It's a safeguard. It's the collaborative safeguard against using bad data, because you're putting it forward first for discussion and critique, and then you don't make decisions on it until at least you've kind of come to a validation, or at least have a directionally correct way to interpret it. Yeah. I'll stop because I'll just go on spewing random thoughts, but I do think there's more data than people realize. We don't have to wait for a dirt report to come out or something like that. Like, the call centers have a wealth of data, and it does take smart brains like Kenny and Greg, but they can all be interpreted. You can put out a dozen different reports on the same or different topics and let people kind of dive in and see what they say. And for what it's worth, AI is always happy to host those as a platform. So the more the merrier.
Thank you, Benjamin. We appreciate your perspective. Megan, did you have any idea that lots of people are going to be talking about this when you guys started, or were you thinking, oh, this is going to help my board and our members, and where do we go from here?
Well, definitely, I wanted it to help all the stakeholders in Georgia for sure.
Sure.
I've heard a lot of people talking about the importance of the data and the transparency, and we've known for years as 811 centers that we had a lot of data. We didn't have an affordable way to mine it until recently, and that is bringing so much more information to the table. So now I can ask that kind of pie in the sky question, like, how many times is the excavator actually able to start work, but the member's still in compliance with the law? So that the data gives us that. PRIS codes, to me, and the evolution they take during a ticket, I think, is how we move this conversation forward in the future. But the more data we look at and the more questions we ask, is just going to, like the what's the little critter? You cut one head off and two grow back, the hydra, and that it?
Yeah.
I think the more we get into this, the more questions we're going to have, and the more valuable conversations we're going to have. To James's point, we've got to really get in there and kind of see what is working, what isn't, can we improve it? And a lot of times the data, we're looking at it like, prove me wrong too. And it just, we've got to share it and be open. And I think I'm super excited to hear this conversation has value beyond Georgia. that is lets me know. It's a little validating, to be honest, that it wasn't
Yeah.
just a weird one-off thing happening in my state, but this was like a legitimate thing that needed a little bit more review and dialogue about. I think as long as we keep searching and asking each other questions and bouncing this around with each other, we're just going to keep coming back with probably tougher questions, but even better answers.
Yeah, I really commend you, Megan, for the position you've taken here rather than becoming defensive. This is what our data showed, and if your data shows something different wherever you are, that's okay.
Yeah, the goal is
I
to
really, yeah,
have conversations.
yeah,
100%.
yeah, good for you. Scott, so what's it going to take for us to get where we need to be on this
Oh,
topic of excavator readiness?
yeah. I mean, I think we're going in the right direction. It's this conversation. It's other conversations that are happening. It's asking questions. It's refusing to simply accept something carte blanche and not question it. There's so many opportunities to raise questions that simply the individual putting forth something should welcome, because it's a position where you're able to challenge yourself as well. And if you can't answer a question, that's the best position to be in, because now you found something new that you need to know, and then that brings about growth and it helps the industry move forward. If we're sitting here blindly following assertions that are advanced, we're like a car on ice that's just spinning wheels. Only through some sort of conflict, dialogue, debate, discussion, questions do we get the friction we need to move forward. And we should all respect each other and recognize these are not attacks. There is absolutely nothing about my paper that's attacking Georgia. It's claiming, a great deal of thanks to Georgia for what Georgia did and to inspire us to look at this particular topic. And the thing about data, we are not only as call centers, notification centers, sitting on a large amount of data, we're also as a society sitting on more information and data than any time in human history in regard to its accessibility. And we have to be careful with that, because with more information, that's not always meaning it's good information. And we have to vet that information. We have to discuss, we have to question that information. And that's why I started the paper with, after the open letter, a quote from, Shakespeare, and looking at the early modern period, that the basic challenges within the humanities are still applicable to today in the high-tech world, and that not everything with sound and fury is entirely meaningful. We have to question it to determine if it is or not. And we can only do that if we have an environment where we're open to dialogue, we're respectful, and we're accepting questions and not seeing them as threats. I welcome people. I want people to question this paper and to try to understand and help us better understand even what we're trying to say. We all become stronger in that way. And the one thing I would say, is that we do need to be careful with the anonymity when reports are coming out, but yet we don't know where the data is coming from because of anonymity and a need for anonymity for people to share their data. That kind of weakens the data. It can't be vetted. It can't be verified. And I would encourage all of us to bear warts and all in regard to our data, and recognize that when we share even the bad data, even if our study had come out that we were at 10% excavation readiness, the paper would have still been written. It would have been taking a slightly different perspective, but it would have been very much open, because then that would show, hey, we need help, and we want to share this to get a dialogue going to help us move in a positive direction. So I would encourage everyone to not share things anonymously, but to be open and transparent about what they're finding in their states.
Noticed the chat a while ago from Miss Susan Bowl, and she made a good point about possibly the need for common terminology, and I know there's value in that.
Yeah.
I would say, at least if we didn't use common terminology, that we ought to at least have a legend that defines what we mean when we say this or we say that in the spirit of transparency. James, do you think it's possible, going back to what Megan said a while ago, do you think it's possible that we'll all be able to win this battle only when we're willing to understand that our state is unique and different than neighboring states or states, in a different quadrant of the country, and that while we're sharing this information, we need to be very transparent about what we mean when we say what we say, rather than everybody measure themselves by the same factor.
So, when Scott was just talking about the transparency, in some ways, the 811 centers are in a difficult spot because we're funded by our member utility operators, but yet we are, with this data, in some ways calling out their bad behavior, right? And so I am, luckily, my board of directors has been very supportive of transparency. So we even give the regulator the report of who's using what code by member, so they can see who's is someone asking for a negotiated marking schedule and disproportionately large amount of times, or using the code 80, which is meant for like earthquake or act of God situations, and that got used a lot during COVID, and much discussion about if that's appropriate to use for staffing related situations and things like that. But thinking about at the national level, where things are aggregated into dirt and anonymized, which makes it hard, especially because it's difficult to get it like at the county level. California is an enormous state, and what's happening in one county is different than what's happening in another county, and that happens in every state, I'm sure. And so but it has to be anonymized. Otherwise, if you say, well, it's gas in this county, but people know that there's only one large gas provider in this county, then they can figure that out. And for investor-owned utilities, that causes problems about stock prices potentially being affected, and big telecoms and things like that. So I get it as far as the need for anonymity with damage data, but perhaps this can be what offsets, as far as if we have transparency in how the codes are used, and all the 811 centers have the support, or perhaps it just takes the regulator to demand that they give those numbers regardless. And now we'll circle back to the importance of enforcement again. But then maybe that can be used to compare with damages, even if we can't look at damages every detail in a public way. The regulators can look at that, but like PHMSA, for example, but we can't all as the public. So I think this could tie together nicely.
Yeah, and to be clear, we don't want to use this as pointing fingers at any entity or anything like that. There is a need for some sort of opaqueness within it, but if part of the transparency and the open individuals, these entities are anonymous. This data could not be vetted. It could not be verified. If it is accurate, it suggests the following. Possibly needs to be a way to handle this, because a lot of times conclusions are advanced as truth when they're not necessarily. They still are open for questioning. And I think that part of sharing that data in that context helps individuals who are reading it can recognize the limitations to the data in a particular contextual instance. So
yeah, that is one thing that's tough about dirt data in general, because in some states it's heavily skewed, being basically only gas data. Gas is required to report nationwide, but and then in other states, it's all across the spectrum, right, as far as what's reported, and so that makes it difficult to draw conclusions at large scale. But it's the best we have, and super valuable. I use the dirt data constantly to say, hey, look, our percentage of tickets or percentage of damages that are due to no ticket is significantly higher than the national average in California. We're still in the mid to high 30s. And the national average has been, mid to high 20s the last few years. And so we're way above. So I use that as justification to get additional funding for marketing and education.
Yeah.
So in some ways, we have to compare ourselves to other states for these purposes.
So to those who are following on online, we're going to be sending out a survey here shortly. You'll see the link in the chat. We'd ask you to respond to that survey request. We'd appreciate it. There are also other questions we're simply not going to have time to get to. Thank you for your interest. I'll tell you what we'll do is we'll make a list of those questions and we'll send them out to these panelists, and then we'll write an article and give you a chance to read that in our next issue of our Global 811 magazine. But the time has come to ask the entire panel for a key takeaway from today's discussion as you've listened to one another talk about these specific issues. Give some thought to what is your key takeaway from today's discussion. And we'll start with Benjamin.
I appreciate it, Roger.
Yes.
One of the things that has come out, I think, in this discussion that I think is interesting, I don't know if everyone is familiar with the concept of fractals, of repeating patterns that as you go zoom in, they repeat and repeat and repeat. I think something within the damage prevention industry that looks like a fractal to me is the membership model. CGA is the member model for the whole industry. And then one of its members is the call centers. And it's made up of those members. It's governed by the board of the utilities. And so you kind of zoom in and it keeps fractaling outward. And so I see that as a beautiful amount of collaboration and all these opportunities to collect data, to have people bounce ideas off of. But there's also a natural inherent limitation in how you can create progress within that kind of member-driven consensus model. Member-driven, absolutely fundamental and important. Consensus, absolutely fundamental and important. But it can also lead to that kind of tension where one stakeholder group wants to advance something or try something different. And when you're inside of that consensus model where everyone has to agree, or the members themselves have to propose how you go forward, it can be a little limiting, which doesn't mean it's not still the right way to move forward, but it can slow potential progress. And so that's one of those spaces where I think that should absolutely continue 100%. People should drive forward in the member model and additively look outside to say, where are the outside resources? Who can provide an analysis or a platform that adds to this in a complementary way? And I think that's where AII is really trying to position ourselves to be a resource to the industry. And like I said, we're not stakeholders, so we don't try to tell you what your job is. But if you can tell us, or you can tell our audience, or you can tell the industry with sort of an outside of that member-driven model, we're happy to host it. And I think there's more of that that's needed in critiquing existing data, putting forward working papers to be critiqued even before they're published. I think there's tons of opportunity for that in the data analysis transparency realm that can really add value.
I thank you. For a very long time, I've always appreciated people who would encourage me to think and not tell me what to think. I appreciate it. Kenny, your key takeaway.
That's a good question. Thanks, Roger. I might be getting off track a little bit here, but my key takeaway is not really about excavation readiness. I think it's an interesting metric. I'm happy that we're talking about it. I view it more as a vehicle for a larger conversation. To me, it really is about that transparency into methodology. I'm fully aware we live in the age of clickbait, and I understand that attention-grabbing headlines, attention-grabbing statistics are really important. We need them to get engagement. Totally get that. And I think that's okay, or it can be okay. But once I'm reading the report or whatever's the publication, if there's a conclusion being shared, and I'm expected to put stock in that, I need to know how we got there. And so for me, it's really critical that when we have these conversations that we're open and transparent with our methodology. And I think, certainly Scott did that with his paper. I would challenge anyone to read that paper and ask how we came up with those numbers. I pretty much detailed that line by line. So I think we need to see more of that in short.
Thank you so much, Kenny. Appreciate you. Greg, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I really have two. So one of the things that has come up is how do we make sure that these definitions are consistent, right? So we want transparency. We need common definitions. And I'm going to plug the FNCA. That's exactly what we did here, right? So the excavation readiness document is published out there from the Data and Trends Committee. It's there. It defines all the terms and explains the entire process of what we did. The second takeaway I heard over and over, it's really just the beginning. So what that means to me as a data practitioner is, yes, just as Kenny said, we have this one metric, it's a percentage, right? And in Georgia, that's a statewide percentage. Okay, we have other data, right? So how do we then slice it up to discover the causes, right? The Virginia paper talked about these rural telecom deployments, and that is a great insight. So there's other sources of data that we need to share or participate in. For instance, the USDA publishes this thing that just came across my attention, which is the rural urban continuum codes, which lists every county in the country and rates it on a scale of 1 to 9 about how rural or how urban it is. Say that 5 times fast. Right. But those are things that we can blend in with this data to see how different counties of similar ruralness or urbanness compare. Right. We're also working with a third party to classify every excavator in the state into one of 21 different buckets. What type of excavators are they? How do we measure their readiness against others? Right. So these are other insights. We're just beginning. I can throw question after question after question at this and find out, okay, so when I start asking those questions, I'm like, okay, what data do I need to support that? Let's get that data and let's look. So yes, common definitions and transparency. And the second thing is we're just starting.
I like it, Greg. Thank you. James, key takeaway, brother.
Following up on Greg and really what everyone else has said is that this is an exciting time for data and data used to make decisions. One of the key things that I keep thinking about is excavators are complaining that tickets aren't ready. Well, but a lot of the work they're doing is utility work. So it's ultimately one project owner is a utility owner who's upset that the locators for other utility owners are not responding to their project fast enough. And so in some ways they're kind of doing it to each other, or not entirely utility operators, because you also have municipalities in there too who are doing their road projects and DOTs and things like that. But ultimately, these are all projects in which they all know utilities are there and that it's in a public space. This is not the small homeowner projects and the fencers and the landscapers. It's all these utility related things. So if we ever get to a point about a queue or bottlenecking certain things, perhaps it is if you're in the utility bucket. And so that's what goes to what Greg just said about now you're classifying excavators and type of work. And so we got to probably start having discussions about, do we want to have standards of what type of work is being done so that we can measure, and that means drop-down menus instead of free-form text, and getting rid of the excavator being able to say, I am a homeowner, I'm doing a pool and a fence and rose bushes, and my favorite variety of tree is the whatever, and forcing them to say, okay, you're doing landscaping or something along those lines. So but again, I think the future of data, Scott mentioned the most data we have in human history, and Megan said it's now affordable to mine. That's a great point about being affordable. and we have tools and AI and all these things, AI and AI. Just, yeah, anyway. All right, enough from me.
Did good. Thanks, James. Miss Megan?
As I was listening to everybody, and everyone's spot on about the takeaways. I just want to go back and talk about. We spent some time talking about each state has different sets of data, and there's a lot of reasons for that. It typically hinges on the maturity of someone's statute. But what's underneath that is we're all trying to let people work. We're trying to plan excavation. We're trying to transmit the messages, trying to get the paint on the ground. We're trying to work to get started. That is the common denominator between all of us. And us questioning our specific data is still helping answer and improve that common process for all of us. Because if one of us then figures out something awesome and then we share it with each other, which is so very unique and collaborative of the 811 center industry. We got to keep going. And Greg's right. This is absolutely just the beginning, and I'm excited to be a part of it.
Thank you kindly. Scott, you got the last word, brother.
Well, fantastic. It was an honor to be here today. Thank you so much. And it's even more of an honor, though, to be in an industry with so many passionate individuals. I mean, you can hear it in the conversation we had today, and really trying to do the best we can to ensure everyone can start work on time, but make it home alive and safe, and protect the underground utilities that the members we serve, and that essential services can continue. I underscore everything everyone said about takeaways. My only thing I would add in addition to that is I think we need to have more Gregs and Kennys in the discussions around data. If you are a notification center and you don't have a data analytics arm or real presence, I'd encourage you to explore how you could bring such a department into your center. We do have more data. It is affordable now. Great point, Megan. We've got to have professionals who understand data to be able to engage that data, and to give all of us in leadership positions the knowledge we need to make better decisions and to better vet the data, and of course ensure that there's that transparency. So again, thank you all for allowing me to be here today and to be here with me today. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. And next month, Town Hall is going to be that topic about kicking the can down the road, abandoned facilities. We're going to explore that a little bit closer. Thanks to everybody. Thanks for joining us, folks. We appreciate it.